Barack Obama is re-elected. The Republican Party faces tough choices. What do the next 4 years have in store? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. It was a convincing victory for Barack Obama, but according to the popular vote, the US is split roughly in half, with the president only winning by a 2% margin. President Obama will also have to face a House of Representatives that remains under the control of the Republicans. It was a good night, though, for the Democrats in the Senate. Not only did the party keep control, but key figures of the extreme Republican right were defeated. In addition, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin became the first openly gay politician to be elected to the Senate. There were also a number of significant ballot measures passed. 2 states voted to legalize gay marriage, and 2 legalized recreational marijuana use. But after the most expensive campaign in American history, with $2.6 billion spent by both parties, we are left with the incumbent remaining in the White House and no change of hands in the House or Senate. So how much has changed? Does a chastened Republican Party begin moderating its more extreme positions on social and economic policy? And will President Obama, whose populist message of taxing the rich and fighting inequality struck such a chord, now unabashedly fight for a more equitable society? We'll examine those issues in a moment. But first, here's some of what President Obama had to say after winning re-election.
We want our children to live in America that isn't burdened by debt, that isn't weakened by inequality, that isn't threatened by the destructive power of a warming planet. We want to pass on a country that's safe and respected and admired around the world. A nation that is defended by the strongest military on earth and the best troops this world has ever known. But also a country that moves with confidence beyond this time of war to shape a peace that is built on the promise of freedom and dignity for every human being.
I spoke to the civil rights leader and former presidential candidate Jesse Jackson. I asked him what he expects over the next 4 years.
You know, in some sense, a continuation of what he has begun. When he started 4 years ago, we were 4 million jobs in the hole. We've gained 5 million. That's a swing of 9 million. The banks were in collapse. They were in free fall. The automotive industry was in free fall. He stopped the hemorrhaging. And now, of course, the automotive industry is moving again. It's number one again, working 3 shifts in Illinois and in Ohio and in Michigan, for example. More students have Pell Grants.
See, when you say it's going to be more of the same, that's going to make many in his progressive base a little disappointed. They say that his first 4 years, he wasn't interested in reshaping society. He was interested in saving an unequitable corporate-controlled society from its own greed, if anything. They want a different President Obama this time.
No, I think the first issue was to stop the hemorrhaging. And now it's time to expand. For example, the home foreclosure crisis that virtually came to a halt. And that was a big deal. Now, it is fair to say we bail out the banks, not link the lending of the reinvestment, and that must happen. You must revive the Glass-Steagall Act on banks so they cannot lend and invest under the same roof. That has to change. I think we cannot run the risk of more wars and provocative wars with these drone attacks, for example, but at least I think he is freer to make some of those bold decisions now than he was 4 years ago, or even a year ago.
What gives you the impression that that reflects the real Barack Obama any more than the sort of institution of the drone warfare, the bailing out of the banks that we saw over the last 4 years that we have already seen? Isn't that the real Barack Obama? What does this man actually believe? No one really knows.
Well, for example, the banks, they bailed out the banks and they were still charging students 7%, but they were getting 0 interest. And he moved the banks out the middle. About $70 billion went to students for Pell Grants. That was a bold step. He promised he would end the war in Iraq. For all practical purposes, it has ended. And there's a countdown there coming out of Afghanistan. You know, we spent $1 to $3 trillion in the war in Iraq. What could $1 trillion do today? Wipe out every state budget deficit, rehire every police, every teacher, every fireman. So ending the war in Iraq, coming out of Afghanistan, promises in the progressive direction. I think there must be some plan now for a new trade policy. Here in Freeport, Illinois, 175 jobs left the Sensata plant that makes sensors to China just this past Monday. It happened to be that while he bailed out the automotive industry, Bain Capital sold those jobs to China for 99 cents an hour wages. Well, we must have a trade policy that makes that impossible, if not illegal.
Right, but once again, we have to point to his record over the last 4 years where President Obama continuously says he believes in the sort of free trade agreements which lead to outsourcing of American jobs. When he bailed out the auto industry or the banks, he didn't have any kind of stringent restrictions on what they might do then with taxpayers' money. He allowed them to outsource, or for suppliers to outsource, or for the banks not to write down people's foreclosures. Again, it's that level of trust that we have in what he actually believes.
And I think that becomes his burden second time around, because free trade will only make sense if it is fair trade. It is not fair when you close, plants close, jobs leave, and drugs and guns come. You've got to address the issue of violence. They had the debate in Denver, Colorado. The Colorado never mentioned semi-automatic weapons just after the massacre in Aurora, Colorado, and Columbine. They had a debate in Kentucky, Biden and Ryan. They never mentioned poverty. 50 million Americans are now in poverty. 54 million are food insecure. They had a debate in Florida, never mentioned the impact of voter suppression, not poverty, not racial disparities. These issues, to be sure, will have to be dealt with this time around.
So, what should we expect from President Obama's second term? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Ryan Grimm, Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post. Also here is Bill Fletcher Jr., a trade union activist and executive editor of blackcommentator.com. And from Salt Lake City, Rocky Anderson joins us. He was the Justice Party's candidate for the presidency. Bill Fletcher, you weren't happy terribly with President Obama's first term, but nonetheless you said vote President Obama, get him back into office, and then pressure him from the left. Are you filled with hope for the next 4 years?
I'm actually filled with hope. And part of that hope is based less on what I expect President Obama to do on his own and what I actually expect that people are going to force him to do. I think that for the first 4 years, and certainly for the first 2 years, too many of his supporters sat back and waited for him to deliver. They didn't understand who he was and what his administration represented. They interpreted too much from the speeches as opposed to the actual politics of the administration. So by the time people realized the propensity of the administration to compromise, its interest in protecting big capital, we had lost the initiative to the Tea Party. And I think, frankly, if it hadn't been for the Occupy movement, we'd be having a very different discussion right now.
Right, but the argument is, though, that President Obama, partly because of his speeches, and because he's not the Republican Party, the left does tend to go to sleep, actually, once he gets into the Oval Office. And he's actually then able to pass legislation from drone strikes and kill lists to what was effectively a rather right-wing health reform bill in the end, let's face it, from the Heritage Foundation, expanding private insurance, which, if Republicans had tried, actually, there would have been many more objections to. Now, so looking forward then, as we look at Social Security and all these other things that are coming up, is the same going to happen?
Well, not necessarily. I think that there's historical examples of situations where there have been anemic Democrats, Franklin Roosevelt in his first term, John F. Kennedy, who were pushed by social movements to be more than they actually had planned on being. So the historical record is clear. It can be done. The question is, will it be done? And the discussions that I've had with a number of different movement leaders and activists is that there's a different way that people are approaching this next number of months, literally, not just the next 4 years, and are looking with the anticipation that we're going to have to hit the ground running.
Rocky Anderson, in your experience then, how does President Obama react to that sort of pressure from progressive forces, whether they be in Congress or from outside of Congress through activism?
Well, there were people pushing from the left during the beginning of the Obama administration, and his chief of staff was telling them to all just shut up and get in line. And unfortunately, that's what much of the Democratic Party and most of their members did. They sat by while President Obama was targeting U.S. citizens for assassination, carrying on this outrageous drone killing program, during the course of which hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent civilians in 4 sovereign nations have been killed. They're carrying on this incredible spying program now under the amendment to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This has turned into a national security state. It's getting worse. Now with the president signing into law what a bipartisan Congress passed that would give the federal government the authority to kidnap and imprison people, including U.S. citizens, with no charges, trial, legal assistance, or right of habeas corpus. So those who are saying, I heard Jesse Jackson earlier talk about how bold President Obama had been. Yeah, he'd been bold in building up the imperial presidency and taking this country down a very totalitarian course. It's an incredibly dangerous moment in our nation's history.
Ryan Grimm, I mean, a lot of those issues weren't even discussed in the debates between the Republicans and the Democrats. I know they were discussed in the third-party debates, as we know, on Al Jazeera at least. But as far as the economic issues are concerned, which were discussed, I mean, it was notable that both President Obama and Mitt Romney had to kind of pivot to a more populist, populist set of principles in order to get the vote out. And yet there is that suspicion that the President Obama, now that he's got that vote, will simply pivot back to where he was before, which is bipartisan compromise. And bipartisan compromise means compromising with an extremely right-wing Congress and accepting their framework for economic development, which isn't Bill Fletcher's framework for economic development, as far as I'm aware.
Right. I mean, it goes back to what Bill was saying. You know, the president will do what he's forced to do, and Rocky's exactly right that the chief of staff in the beginning said everybody sit down and shut up, and almost everybody did sit down and shut up. But the difference between then and now is that they saw what happened when they sat down and shut up. And the White House now has a different attitude towards outside groups. They were not willing to take criticism from the outside left in the beginning, but they saw that it was backfiring on them and that they didn't have any protection. So they're now much more willing and open to
What's that based
handle.
On? Where are you seeing that?
Reporting that I've spoken to a lot of the outside groups and the White House. They're telling me that they have a new attitude about how they're willing to accept criticism. Now, sometimes when the criticism actually comes, they lose that philosophy. Because it's much more difficult to handle in the specific.
And Ryan, you must have heard. I mean, those more progressive voices in Congress, many of whom have been re-elected, are relatively terrified about what is going to happen to Social Security as these budget negotiations start because of the fiscal cliff. I don't know whether you can very briefly explain what the fiscal cliff is, but that's going to be the big issue now coming up in the next months. Actually, first explain that very quickly.
So the fiscal cliff is a deadline, January 2nd, when a whole host of policies expire. The Bush tax cuts expire, defense cuts take effect, and some social spending cuts take effect. This is all the result of this compromise, this budget compromise of 2011. So Congress set this up on its own. Democrats feel like they have the upper hand, though, because if nothing happens, the Pentagon gets cut, millionaires and billionaires get a tax hike. Two things that the Republicans don't want to happen. Whereas the pain on the Democratic side is about $500 billion in social spending over 10 years, which compared to the pain that the Republican side would feel is minimal. So they feel like they can allow this.
And yet there's that sense amongst progressives that he's not going to use that leverage, even as the Republicans, face turmoil about trying to figure out what they actually stand for. Instead, actually, he's going to offer them, as he already has, a compromise, a grand bargain, which is so far to the right of a progressive framework, Bill Fletcher, that many progressives throw their hands up in the air. Again, where does the hope lie in that? They will cut Social Security. They will take on a framework that spending is bad, that the social safety net is something to be cut, and so forth.
Well, let's just go back for a second to this thing that Rocky mentioned about what Rahm Emanuel said. Part of my feeling was, well, why did we listen? I mean, why? I mean, I don't really care what Rahm Emanuel says. Why would people be demobilized at that point. And part of the reason was that there's a way in which many social movements become deceived, seduced perhaps, by the notion of the access to power rather than understanding what power is. In this case, we have to be prepared to lose access, to lose the ability to walk into the White House and have tea and coffee in the name of actually building a movement.
You think that's going to happen? I mean, it was quite interesting how this time around, despite President Obama favoring Wall Street, that, right. Wall Street deserted him. The unions, right. however, who weren't favored by President Obama, stuck by him and got the vote out.
They stuck by him because
Do you really
of the
think that President Obama is going to remember that now and think about that as he moves forward with workers' rights?
He'll remember it if we force him to remember it. That's the bottom line.
He still has to be forced, though.
He has to, absolutely. Yeah. Because his instinct as a corporate liberal, he is not even a Lyndon Johnson. He is a corporate liberal who embraces neoliberal economics. So as a result, he has to be forced. We can't rely on his good feeling. Yes, he's a wonderful person, very interesting guy, very good listener, but that's irrelevant. We're dealing with an administration. We're not dealing with a person.
Rocky Anderson, does that fill you with hope?
I don't have a lot of hope unless we, the American people, assume that mantle of responsibility.
Yeah, but do you think that's going to happen then? Bill Fletcher thinks that is going to happen, that this time around Barack Obama was voted in by a base who's aware who President Obama is. Do you actually believe that is the case, or are they going to hope that President Obama will just change this time around?
No, I think people are on fire in this country.
Right.
During the last year going around this country during this campaign, people across the political spectrum have had it with the corrupting influence of money. Everybody in this country knows we have a plutocracy where those with the money, especially Wall Street, they call all the shots in Congress and in the White House. And as a result, we have the greatest disparity in income and wealth than at any time since the 1920s. And it's had horrendous impacts on the vast majority of people. You know, under Obamacare, we will have 30 million people in this country without any essential health care coverage by the year 2022. We can't put up with that. And I think that we're going to be able to build these coalitions where we can put other differences aside and say we're going to join arms and we're not going to let up until we see our government cleaned up, until we see an end to this empire building, and until we see real financial reforms put in place. It was appalling that during these mainstream presidential debates, nobody talked about restoring Glass-Steagall, nobody talked about effective regulatory protections to make sure we don't have another economic meltdown, and nobody even mentioned the fact that under the Obama administration, these folks on Wall Street got away with massive financial fraud, and we still don't see any prosecution.
Rocky, we'll leave the discussion about President Obama's future and the progressive future there for the moment. Rocky and Ryan, you'll stay with us. Bill Fletcher, though, thank you very much. We're going to move on now to what this all means for the Republican Party. One of the notable moments of election night was when Republican strategist and Fox News contributor Karl Rove questioned the network's decision to call the election for Barack Obama.
The website is now being crashed because they can no longer refresh it. But look, I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we got to be careful about calling things when we have like 991 votes separating the two candidates and a quarter of the vote yet to count. Even if they have made it on the basis of select precincts, I'd be very cautious about intruding into this process.
Well, folks,
thanks.
So maybe not so fast.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. It's great to have you guys here.
That's awkward.
And joining us now from Philadelphia is Joe Watkins, who worked in the White House under George H.W. Bush and has acted as a surrogate for the Mitt Romney campaign. Ryan Grimm of the Huffington Post and presidential candidate Rocky Anderson still with us as well. Joe Watkins, I mean, many of us, we couldn't help but wonder what was going on in the Fox studio at that moment. I mean, was this a symbolic moment for the cracking up of the Republican Party?
Well, clearly the Republican Party has a lot of work to do. Yesterday, I think, spoke loudly and clearly to some of the challenges that the party faces going forward. You cannot win a national election in the United States of America
without including African Americans, Latinos, women, young people, and various other groups. And the days of the Republican Party depending upon one segment of the society, in particular white males, to carry an election, those days are over.
Is that really how
the Republican Party has a lot of work to do?
Is that really how it's being seen, or is it being seen as Mitt Romney not being conservative enough to carry the election?
No, I don't think so. I think Mitt Romney didn't have enough time to move back to the center because of the primary process. He was forced pretty much over to the right. And I think he worked pretty hard to get himself back to the center, but he was plagued by some of the statements that he made during the primary campaign that really pegged him to the right. And I think that hurt him in the general election with independent voters.
Ryan Grimm, what are you hearing about the debate in the Republican Party right now?
Well, they have two choices. You know, they can continue to be the party that he described and be sectional and regional and driven mostly by white male voters. And then they can nominate a Latino for president and hope to paper over the structural issues that way. And they'll always have a funding base. You know, they'll have the billionaires and the millionaires who are willing to fund the campaign, so that they could continue to be, you know, competitive without addressing their structural problems. Or they could try to do that. The first way they could do it is by doing immigration reform. But that would require some type of compromise with Democrats and some type of amnesty for people who are here undocumented. Rush Limbaugh was on his radio show today flailing about this possibility, throwing his arms in the air, saying, okay, so we don't get enough women, we don't get enough Latinos, so what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to embrace illegal aliens? We're supposed to give away free birth control? He doesn't want to do that. He wants to stand on principle. There are millions of Republicans who are going to stand with him. So that's the contest between people who want to nationalize this party and people who want to stand on this principle, but it's a principle that's only going to be followed by white males and then tiny minorities of the rest of the country.
Rocky Anderson, as someone who's been fighting for more so-called third-party inclusion, this might be an interesting moment for the two-party system. What do you see is happening right now?
Well, I think with both parties going so far to the right in the last several years, there is plenty of room for a good, moderate coalition that is focused on cleaning up corruption in our government, focused on ending these outrageous wars and the empire building, getting our budget under control, ending these giveaways to the military-industrial complex, and cleaning up the financial industry. These are things that the majority of Americans want to see our Congress and White House do, and almost none of that was discussed during this campaign by the mainstream parties.
Ironically, I suppose, Rocky, I mean, on some of the issues that you were talking about earlier, the drone wars, the kill lists and so forth, I mean, there's that libertarian wing of the Republican Party who are far more progressive than Barack Obama in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yes. And I think that there is plenty of room for people that are usually viewed as being on opposite ends of the political spectrum to come together on these issues and really push effectively to turn these things around, because we're on a disastrous course, especially in terms of our foreign relations right now, generating so much more hatred and hostility, and all of that undermines our long-term security.
Joe Watkins, I mean, when you say that the party has to change because of demography, is it because then, does the Republican have to change what it actually believes in, or is it a kind of cynical move? I mean, they're still going to be pretty racist, they're still going to have a low opinion of women, but they're just going to grudgingly adapt? I mean, what does it mean in an ideological sense? What does it mean to change?
Well, it means they have to be accepting of people. They have to reach out to groups that haven't in the past been included in the party, and they've got to listen to them, listen to what they're saying, and have an understanding for what the interests and needs of those groups are.
But then what makes them Republican as opposed to the center-right of the Democrat Party that we're already seeing?
What makes...
Yeah, I mean, a Republican who actually believes in reproductive rights and isn't a racist, isn't that just a Democrat then?
Well, I think that one time there was a centrist part of the Republican Party. There was a wing of the Republican Party that was perhaps more moderate than the part that dominates right now. I mean, look at the party back in the 1960s that was the main driver of the Civil Rights Bill that Lyndon Johnson got passed in 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act that he got passed in '65. and fair housing that he got passed in '66. That was done with the help of Republicans, moderate Republicans who felt that civil rights was an important issue.
Jay Watkins, it's fascinating. Thank you very much. Rocky Anderson, thank you. Ryan Grimm, thank you very much as well. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.